As you can probably guess already from the cover of my presentation, the subject today will involve a specific kind of prognostication that is made through a specific kind of sign-based inference, which is called physiognomical syllogism, physiognomical reasoning. Well, of course, this is a reasoning you might know because it has had a very long tradition, starting from the Babylonian period and arriving up to modernity. The image you have, the very beginning of our presentations, are drawn from the Laporta's work, so are drawn from a modern re-elaboration of this kind of sign-based inference. But what I would like to do today is to focus on the medieval history, on a specific moment of the medieval history of this kind of reasoning as a means to prognosticate, to have knowledge of something that is not immediately visible, to guess, to infer something that is not immediately visible from something visible, in a moment that can be defined as the peak, probably, of the logical elaboration in the Arab Islamic tradition, namely Avicenna's philosophical work. So reading the face, predicting the mind, well, it's a timeless challenge. Even nowadays, we are still challenged with problems concerning the ways in which we can try to infer what we do not see from what we see. There are several, these are just newspaper titles from 2019, 2024, 2024. So very recent newspaper titles in which you can spot really the obsession with trying to understand what is in someone's mind, trying to predict what could be the behaviors and deriving from something that is in someone's mind, starting from facial expressions, from bodily image, from bodily characteristics, and so on. So it's really, as I was saying, a timeless challenge that actually has a very long history, and that is well attested, whose roots are well attested in the Babylonian period, but especially in a Greek classical period. Just to give you an example of how widespread the practice of physiognomical reasoning was already in antiquity, this is a poem that was on a tomb of a certain Eusthenes. It's a poem by Leonidas from Tarentum. And the Eusthenes in question, the person that is celebrated by this poem, by this eulogy, is qualified as physiognomon Sophistes, a philosopher physiognomist that was skillful in learning the thought of people from the eye. So as you can see, the roots are really already there, the roots of our discipline. But what I'm interested in today is not just, the social historical context in which this practice has developed, of course, but which is the logical structure according to which we could build physiognomical reasoning in a way as to legitimate our inferences as sign-based inferences from the visible to the invisible. So this is what Avicenna, in my own view, tries to do. And I can anticipate a bit my conclusion, which is the reason why this presentation also fits in the general framework of the research conducted within the center. And it is precisely that I think that in Avicenna, the logical structure itself legitimating the possibility to infer from physical characteristics, invisible, non-physical characteristics and thoughts and characters and dispositions of the human soul are grounded in a medical notion, which is that of mixture. We will see together. So a brief history, just to be sure we are all on the same page on the sources that are relevant for us today. This is not meant to be a comprehensive history of the physiognomic tradition, of course. It's just to give you an overview of the main texts that are involved, that were relevant from the Greek to the Arabic tradition. And perhaps one of the most relevant is a pseudo-Aristotelian treatise, actually. Um, I will open this parenthesis. Aristotle did not write a specific treatise on physiognomical reasoning. What we have by Aristotle, we will see today together, we will go through it. It's a small dissertation, a small anticipation on the characteristics of physiognomics and on the possibility of physiognomics at the very end of the prior analytics. But we do not have a real independent treatise on physiognomics by Aristotle. By contrast, what we have is actually a treatise that is also that also comes from the peripatetic tradition, so to speak, in a broad sense, that is probably dated around the fourth, third century before Christ, and that was ascribed historically to Aristotle, but which is considered spurious, not genuine today, which is this physiognomonica that you see on the first line. It's extant in Greek, and it was also known to the Arabs because it was translated in the 9th century by one of the greatest translators from one of the greatest protagonists of the movement of translations from Greek into Arabic, which is Hunayn ibn Ishaq. Then certainly very influential was a treatise by Polemon of Laodicea, but this treatise is lost in Greek. It certainly circulated according to the biobibliographic sources in Arabic under the title Kitab al-Firasa, so Book of the Physiognomics. That much concerning the Greek treatise. Of course, this is not the only Greek treatise produced on the subject, but those are those that were the most influential for the Arabic tradition that is of our interest today. And then we have some works that were actually generally produced in Arabic. Another work that was ascribed to Aristotle, but it is pseudo-Aristotelian, is the Sirr al-Asrar, the Secret of the Secrets, a compilation from the 9th and 10th century. And then the Book of Medicine for Mansur by Abu Bakr al-Razi, especially the second treatise, contains some reflections on physiognomy. So let's get into the core of our subject today, and let's first approach the theoretical foundations for an inference from the body to the soul, from bodily characteristics to the soul disposition within the Aristotelian tradition, within the peripatetic tradition. When I say Aristotelian in this case, I'm using the adjective in a very broad sense because, as I've said a moment ago, we do not have a really Aristotelian, a properly Aristotelian treatise on physiognomics. So my following analysis will embrace both the pseudo-Aristotelian treatise on physiognomy and Aristotle's, the final part of Aristotle's prior analytics. So let's start from the pseudo-Aristotelian treatise, because it already allows us to highlight some of the central characteristics of the peripatetic view, peripatetic grounding of the physiognomical reason. So I quote, "The science of physiognomics, as its name implies, deals with the natural affections, the physica pathemata, of disposition, and with such acquired ones as produce any change in the signs, semeia, studied by the physiognomist. What these are will be explained later on. I will now state from what types the signs are drawn, and this is the complete number. The physiognomist draws his data from movements, shapes, and colors, and from habits as appearing in a face, from the growth of hair, from the smoothness of the skin, from voice, from the condition of the flesh, from parts of the body, and from the general character of the body. Generally speaking, these are the kind of things which the physiognomists quote about all those types in which the science exists. So what do we have to retain from this first passage? First of all, a connection between the physical pathemata, the natural affections of the body, and the natural affections of the soul's disposition, and the signs, the physical signs, the visible signs in the body. And then there is a list of concrete list of case studies, I mean, of particular elements that are taken into account to form this kind of reason. So these are kind of elements that can represent signs from which we infer the natural affections. And then going on in a passage, a vivid complexion, there are a series of examples that show how this reasoning could work. A vivid complexion shows heat and warm blood, but a pink and white complexion proves a good disposition when it occurs on a smooth skin. Soft hair shows timidity and stiff hair, courage. So you already seen that the physiognomist is able to establish a coupling between a semeion, a visible sign in a body, in a physical appearance of an animal or of a man, we'll see, of a species of living being, and a characteristic of the soul, which is not visible, of course, timidity, courage, and so on. This is based on observation of all the animal kingdom. So here, the author of the Physiognomonica is going into how we are able to establish this coupling between semeia and pathe. For the deer, the hare and the sheep are the most timid of all animals and have the softest hair. The lion and wild boar are the bravest and have very stiff hair. One can see the same things in birds. For generally speaking, those that have stiff wings are brave, and those with soft ones are cowardly, and individually, one can see the same thing among quails and cocks. Exactly the same things occur with the races of men. For those living in the north are brave and stiff-haired, and those in the south are cowardly and have soft hair. So two things to retain from this passage that are very interesting. So first, we've seen there is the coupling between science and pathe, and then he proceeds to explain how he established this coupling. Well, at this point, there are two elements that come into play, because we have the observation of the co-presence, coexistence of a certain sign and a certain pathos of the soul within the specimens, within the instances of a certain animal species or of more animal species. And then we move to compare the case of the co-presence of the signs and the pathos of the sign and the soul's disposition in those animal species with that of the co-presence and coexistence of the two elements in a human species. So as you can see, we already have a structure that implies a comparison, an analogy between two different species. So the coupling, the co-presence, the coexistence between a semeion and a pathos, between a visible sign and the soul's disposition, and a comparison between the cases in which the two are coupled, coexist in an animal species or in more animal species, and the cases in which they coexist in the human species. And why is this interesting? Because, of course, we can imagine one of the most urgent demands, one of the most urgent needs of physiognomy as a discipline, one of the highest interests, was that of trying to understand the human characters and trying to understand what is in a human soul, and not just trying to understand if the lion is brave or if the panther is not, etc. Of course, this was the starting point, but the interest of the practical interest of this discipline, and also the key to its very success, was the possibility itself to apply this to the human species. What grants this possibility, logically speaking? Well, what grounds this possibility is the validity of the passage of the comparison between the case of the observed in the animal species and that observed in the human species. And what grants this passage, logically again, it's the fact of verifying that there is a true causal connection linking the co-presence, the presence of a certain sign and the presence of a certain pathos in the animal species and in the human species. So we will see that what is really relevant in order to grant the possibility of having a physiognomical reasoning is not just simply observing empirically that in most cases or in certain cases or in all cases we can observe a certain science is always co-present with a certain pathos of the soul, with a certain affection of the soul, but it's also to establish a real causal relationship between the presence of a certain sign and the presence of a certain soul's disposition. So this is key to grant the validity of a physiognomical inference. Or this causal relationship is not at all clear in the passage of the pseudo-Aristotelian treatise. It is not still clear yet. You've never seen the word cause here at stake. And this is a very important point that will be addressed actually by Avicenna. So we've seen the pseudo-Aristotelian dissertation on the point. I would move quickly to what Aristotle himself says at the end of the second book of the Prior Analytics, because all the elements are there, and we will see that is more or less in line with the pseudo-Aristotelian elaboration. So knowing from physical appearance, physiognomonein, is possible if someone concedes that the body and the soul are altered simultaneously by such affections as are natural, so the physica pathemata. Now, if this be granted, and in addition that there is a single sign of a single thing, and if we are able to grasp the affection and the sign peculiar to each kind of animal, then we will be able to know from physical appearance. For if there is some affection belonging peculiarly to an invisible kind, as courage to lions, then there must be also some sign, for body and soul are shown to be affected together with each other. Now, the Aristotelian passage adds something more. There is not yet a reflection on the causal link between the sign and the pathos, but there is a requirement for simultaneity and for a biunivocal correspondence between the two. So for a necessary implication between the two. Let this be having, and then there is a famous Aristotelian example. Let this be having large extremities, which may also belongs, of course, to other kinds of animals, for the whole kind, but not a peculiarity of a single kind as we usually use this term. Now, this may be also found in another kind of animal. For instance, a man may be courageous or some other animal. Therefore, this other kind of animal will have the sign, for we assumed there was one sign of one affection. So we assumed that having large extremities always corresponding to be courageous. Consequently, if these things are so, and we're able to collect such signs from those animals which have only some one peculiar affection, and each has a sign since it must have single sign, then we will be able to know from physical appearance. So if we assume that having large extremities always correspond in all the species of animals in which we have observed to being courageous, and a man has large extremities, then we might be able to infer that the men with large extremities, with large limbs, will be also courageous. Still, we might want a more explicit reflection on the causal relationship between the two. So just to summarize, physiognomical reasoning infers a mental characteristic, a pathos, P, in humans, A for anthropos, from the presence of a bodily sign, S for semeion, such that S accompanies P, the semeion accompanies the pathos, in no member of a species different from that of men, from anthropoi, for instance, R. So what is physiognomy in the Aristotelian tradition? Physiognomy provides probable knowledge. It is not an exact science. It is based on at least 5 hypotheses that can be thus summarized. First, natural affections cause an alteration of the soul and a corresponding change in the body, such that the body serves as a sign of the soul. Each semeion, each sign, corresponds to a single affection, to a single pathos, in a one-to-one relationship between semeion and pathos. It is possible to inductively recognize in a species R the same relationship between semeion and pathos, and then the presence of a certain semeion in a human allows one to conclude that the pathos can also be attributed to that human. And the semeion and pathos are present in all members of another species and in some members of human, but not in all, as was the case of the large limbs and the courage. Still, as I was saying, there is no explicit reflection on the causal relationship between the two. So this is why actually physiognomy at this stage provides diagnosis of probable nature. Let's move a bit after setting the foreground to Avicenna's own treatment of physiognomical syllogism. This is a very quick premise. The logical corpus of Avicenna is a vast corpus of around 30 works, and the subject of physiognomical reasoning is treated just in the 3 works that you see highlighted in light red, namely his most comprehensive encyclopedia of Aristotelian peripatetic philosophy, the Kitab al-Shifa, the Book of the Cure. Another shorter Summa of philosophy that is called the Book of Salvation, the Kitab al-Najat, immediately after. And then another, a brief summary, a middle summary on logic. And that is not, the way in which Avicenna treats with physiognomical reasoning in the mid-summary of logic actually bears many resemblances to the way in which he does in a Book of the Cure. So it won't be the object. It's just a shorter version of the way in which he deals in the Cure. So today we will focus on the 2 sections from the philosophical Summa that you have here on the left column. But this overview is just to give you the possibility to appreciate even visually the fact that Avicenna doesn't seem to put so much effort in dealing with physiognomical reasoning. It doesn't give much space to this kind of, to the treatment of this specific kind of reasoning. This is why, it is debated in the studies that have been conducted so far, and I'm mentioning 2 of the greatest experts of the subject concerning Avicenna's philosophy, namely Johannes Thomann and Jens Ole Schmidt, that have been doing a great deal of work on this kind of reasoning in Avicenna, and they both have observed the fact that the puzzling fact that Avicenna doesn't seem to be much interested in this form of reasoning, because it is not included in all logic sections of his works. But the mere fact that Avicenna doesn't seem to devote much space today doesn't allow us to conclude anything, actually, concerning his proper attitude towards this kind of reasoning. and a demonstration of the fact that we are not able to draw any, concluding, conclusive answer on this question is the fact that the scholarship is actually slightly diverging on this matter. I mean, Thoman, for instance, highlighted that there could be some grounding that Avicenna ascribes to physiognomical reasoning, while Jens Ole Schmidt was highlighting the more probabilistic character of this kind of reasoning. So, I mean, it is still possible to oscillate. It is not entirely clear and manifest what Avicenna's approach and what Avicenna's attitude towards this form of reasoning is in his logic. So let's see it together. Well, this is a close-up. It's a close-up showing you how Avicenna concretely structures and in which context Avicenna puts his treatment of physiognomical reasoning within the two philosophical summae, namely the salvation and the cure, or the healing, and in the middle summary on logic, the Mukhtasar al-Awsat fil Mantiq. Now, as you can see, this is a corresponding structure of the final part of the prior analytics in Aristotle. As you can see, in Avicenna as well, this kind of treatment falls within the framework, the more general framework of a series of inductive forms of reasoning, and it is posited here in concomitance with some interesting forms of reasoning. One of those is the sign-based proof, the dalil, the sign, and the other is the example, the tamthil. Why do I say this is interesting? This is interesting because Avicenna highlights how this kind of reasoning is actually somehow in between, should actually be framed as something in between an analogical reasoning composed of 4 terms, like the example is, that involves the comparison of between the specimens of 2 different species. We've seen that in the example of Aristotle between lions and the men, for instance. And sign-based proof, because why sign-based proof? Because just like sign-based proofs and sign-based inferences, our physiognomical reasoning assumes a sign, more specifically a physical sign in this case, as a middle term of the reasoning. So this is a close-up on the Book of Healing, just to show you that this entire section that you've seen, I'm coming back, this entire section that you see concerning inductive forms of inductive reasonings is sometimes absent from the manuscript tradition in some of the most ancient copies of the work. This is an interesting fact that deserves much more study, and it will be studied also. It will be one of the things studied within the framework of our ERC projects, that is trying to understand why this part was sometimes obliterated in some of the most ancient copies. Okay, so I will start actually from the way in which Avicenna approaches the subject, the physiognomical reasoning, in one of the 2 philosophical summae, namely the Book of Salvation, the Kitab al-Najat. The passage already sets one important characteristic that I was anticipating before, namely that the forms of physiognomical syllogism, of physiognomical reasonings, the terms are 4, like the terms of the example, tamthil. For instance, Zaid, it's a proper name, lion, the greatest of the upper limbs that belong to both, which is a given fact, and then courage. So these are our 4 elements. So a human being, the lion, the fact that they both have great upper limbs, and then courage. But the fact that courage belongs to the lion is also a granted fact, a given fact. While the fact that it belongs to Zaid, a human being, calls for proof. After a variety of animals have been observed that share their disposition with the lion, and after it has been observed that what shares courage with it shares this bodily form as well. Then there is another example with nobility, etc. Okay. So we have to be able, I will resume a bit the reasoning, we have to be able to construct our reasoning in the form. Such and such has a broad chest. Everything with a broad chest is courageous because the lion has a broad chest and he is courageous. So we have to be able to construct our reasoning concerning Zaid, claiming that since Zaid has a broad chest, and since everything that has a broad chest is courageous because he have observed is courageous, this holds because we have observed that the lion has a broad chest and is courageous. So I'm sorry, it seems difficult, but I've resumed it here with that scheme that is clear. And I have schematized things in this way. I have schematized the final reasoning in this way. So Zaid has a broad chest. The semeion S inheres in an individual of the species of Anthropos, of men. So the fact of having a broad chest is our sign, and it belongs to a specific individual of the species man, who is Zaid. Everything, so this we can observe. I mean, it's an evidence. We see Zaid and we can observe that he has a broad chest. But then we know that we say that every being with a broad chest is also courageous. So we establish a connection between a pathos and a semeion. So between the pathos of being, of the soul of being courageous, with the semeion of having a broad chest. And how do we establish this passage that allows us to conclude that Zaid then is also courageous? Because the semeion is our middle term that allows us to ascribe the pathos to the individual of the man, to Zaid. So to ascribe also courage to Zaid, and not only the fact that he has a broad chest. How do we are we able to state that everything that has a broad chest is courageous? Well, precisely through the observation of the same co-presence of pathos and sign in a species are different than men, namely lions in this case. So we are able to observe that the lion has a broad chest and he is courageous. So that the semeion belongs to the entire species of lions, and also the pathos belongs to the entire species of lions. So far, so good. So as you can see, our semeion, the fact of having a broad chest, the physical characteristic, is really, technically speaking, our middle term in the reasoning. And it's what allows us to conclude, ascribing to Zaid a feature, a character feature that we're not able to see, to observe. You can see crucial is the comparison with the case of the other species. The problem is that still it is not clear what the causal relationship is between the presence of the semeion and the presence of the pathos in a species of the lions and in a species of the men. So this is what we are looking for is this causal correlation telling us that having a certain physical feature necessarily implies also having a certain disposition of the soul. Well, Avicenna might have an answer for that. Let's move to the other philosophical encyclopedia I was mentioning, the most comprehensive, namely the Book of Healing, the Kitab al-Shifa. At the end of the section corresponding to the prior analytics, Avicenna says that if one knows which passions of the souls are accompanied by which passions of the body, so which path they are accompanied by which semeia, and vice versa, which semeia are accompanied by which path, it becomes possible to use bodily passions and forms are science-based proofs, Dalil, of the passions and dispositions of the soul, or as signs. Thus, if one knows of an animal a particular passion or soul form, such as the courage of the lion, one seeks to identify which bodily states are associated with that soul state and are proper to it, in order to establish the bodily form as a sign of the soul's form. In the case of the lion, for example, the bodily sign is the largeness of the forelimbs. This characteristic belongs specifically to the lion in relation to non-courageous animals, etc. The largeness of the forelimbs is taken as a sign of courage because the correlation is reciprocal. So everything that has large forelimbs is courageous and vice versa. So we still have the elements that we had seen before in the case of Aristotle. I won't read them again. But there is something more in Avicenna. There is a passage, a slight step more forward. The syllogism of physiognomics belongs to the broader category of syllogisms of example and sign. Again, because it has four members, just like the example, and the sign because it takes a sign as a middle term. Indeed, if one grants that the passions and mixtures, and here is the very important terms we have to pay attention to. Passions, al-infialat, the passions of the soul, and the mixtures that occur from the very beginning within the natural disposition in nature are followed by the soul's disposition, akhlaq an-nafs, just as they are also followed by bodily forms, hayat al-badan, then physiognomic is granted. Why do I have highlighted three important terms in bold and two other important terms in red. So first of all, we have the bodily forms that are our semeia, our signs that we already know, and the soul's disposition that are our pathe that we try to ascribe to our subject, that are what we're looking for. But then we have a third element introduced here, which is the real conjunction point in Avicenna's theory of the physiognomical reasoning between the body and the soul, namely passions and mixtures. This mixtures is very important, al-mizajat, it's a technical term to translate what in the Greek tradition was named krases, so the temperaments, the mixtures of the elements whose balance grants a certain physical appearance, but also a certain character disposition. So in this sense, in this technical sense, the presence of a certain mixture, either in an animal or in a living being, is followed by, entails, a certain soul disposition, and is also followed by, it also entails, a certain bodily appearance, a certain bodily form. Here we are introducing, Avicenna is surreptitiously introducing, cautiously introducing, in my own view, some reflection on the causal relationship that is linking not directly bodily forms to the soul dispositions, but mixtures, so the krases of the living beings, to the bodily forms on the one hand and to the soul's disposition on the other. Sorry. And here, it is in the nature of this bodily form to be entailed by a complex mixture, which also entails a disposition of the soul. So a bodily form is entailed, logically, causally entailed by a certain mixture, and that mixture also entails the disposition. When it is granted that bodily forms follow from complex mixtures and matters, and that certain dispositions also follow from them, then the complex mixtures and matters are a cause, and here we really have the causal term we were looking for all of this time, made explicit by Avicenna, are cause for the bodily form and the disposition together at the same time, simultaneously. This latter two follow from them in the body. So this is the scheme, basically. We have our sign, the bodily form, which corresponds to a certain soul's disposition, to a certain hulk, because not just casually, not just in virtue of a certain simultaneity, but precisely because of the presence of a specific complex mixture within the living being, a certain misage, that is granting as a result a certain bodily form on the one end and a certain disposition of the other. So this complex mixture is the trait d'union, is the link between the body and the soul, is the causal link between the body and the soul, the causal link that we were missing in the Aristotelian dissertation, in a peripatetic dissertation on the physiognomical reason. Where does this causal link come from? Well, remotely, it is at least Galen's idea that the powers of the soul follow the mixtures of the body. So this link, this causal link between a certain process, a certain misage, a certain mixture of the elements, of the humid, of the of the other elemental components of the living being, are the cause, establish a link, a causal link between what is in the body and what is in the soul. So it's you can read it in this passage from the a minor treatise from Galen, precisely on the subject, on the idea that the dispositions in the soul follow from bodily temperaments. So to conclude, my idea is that Avicenna's treatment of physiognomical reasoning not only, of course, assumes what was already in the Aristotelian tradition, this kind of correspondence, of univocal correspondence between the sign and the pathos, this co-presence between the sign and the pathos, the comparative structure, the analogical structure of the reasoning, but it goes a little farther beyond by establishing, by looking for a causal relationship between this, the bodily appearance and the inner pathe, and which for Avicenna is grounded in his medical theory, in his Galenic, remotely Galenic medical theory, according to which mixtures, complex mixtures and bodily matter serve simultaneously as causes of both the soul's disposition and the body's form. So I think that, to conclude, that in Avicenna's opinion, even if physiognomical reasoning is not his, the safest way to construct a reasoning and to gain knowledge of something we don't know, it might have some legitimacy if we believe that both what appears and what is inside the human souls are actually grounded on a very physical element, such as that of the complex mixtures. So it is a fine example of how Avicenna's medical theory is also able to ground and to support, in some sense, the logical structure of the physiognomical reasoning in his own logic. So thank you so much for your attention, and I'm open for the Q&A.